So I thought we'd start with the statistic, which is that if you look at the top most global companies from India, a good deal of the top 15, if I remember right, according to a recent study that CMI did, 7 of them belong to the Tata Group. So that kind of allows us to figure out that the Tata Group is very serious about going global. So I thought we'd kick this off by asking David how this has come about. Is it concrete, deliberate strategy? Is it serendipitous? And what are the lessons that other companies wishing to go global, what can they take away from the Tata Group's globalization efforts?
Well, thank you very much. When I was asked to talk about the Tatas, I've got my corporate presentation in the back pocket and lots of slides, which you'll be pleased to know I then ditched. And as soon as I came in and I looked at the group here, I realized that I'm in a huge problem because I've been with Tatas for something like 6 months, and I realize I'm addressing an audience, half of whom at least have been drinking up Tatas almost literally with mother's milk, perhaps Tata tea, Tata coffee, whatever. So I'm not going to tell you about the Tata Group. What I thought I would do is just share a few thoughts about where Tatas have come from, what they're doing here as an example of what an Indian company is doing globally, and just ask a few questions. I don't know if they're provocative questions, but they are consciously idiot boy questions, because I've got that opportunity, having only been doing this job for 6 months, to ask those stupid questions. I'd be very interested, genuinely interested, to hear your thoughts about them. And Tata, if you go into Bombay House in Mumbai, which I suspect many of you have, our corporate headquarters, it looks very colonial, very traditional. You might even find yourself, and I think this is a really nice sign of Indian British humanity, you might find yourself stepping over a dog sitting in the hallway. But actually, Tata is anything but traditional and old-fashioned and stuffy. It's always been disruptive in its business. It's always been innovative. When the founder, Jamshedji Tata, started his big enterprises in the last century, some people were pretty skeptical about it. And you might know the story of about just over 100 years ago, starting the steel business and making steel for the railways. And one of those great figures of the Raj, Sir Frederick Upton, the Chief Commissioner of Indian Railways, said the following: "Do you mean to say that the Tatars propose to make steel rails to British specifications? Why, I will undertake to eat every pound of steel they succeed in making." I think iron is good for the diet, but I don't recommend it. Well, where are we now? $100 billion business, half a billion, 500,000, half a million employees. Over half our revenue comes from outside India, and a whole host of innovations which I could describe to you, but my colleague Rajesh will be doing that later, so I won't. It's only a decade and a half ago that I think that people in Britain would have thought it pretty mad to suggest that an Indian company might be running Tetley Tea, Chorus Steel, Jaguar Land Rover, or that British government, British Telecom, British Airways, most of the big banks would be using the services of an Indian company, Tata Consultancy Services, for a large part of their IT operations. So something very disruptive has happened there. We're a 100 billion business. We've got aspirations to multiply that by 5 in the next decade, eye-watering aspirations. So global growth means growing, I guess, everywhere. So the question is, how would we aim to make a contribution to that in Europe? How would other Indian companies go about doing that? Well, here's my thoughts. We talked about the origins of Tata. I mean, clearly, it wasn't plain sailing for the founders of the company in the Raj. But it was a kind of early globalization, a type of early global competition. Jamshedji Tata went off to the UK. He went to see the cotton mills in Lancashire, determined that the working conditions in his Indian mills should be better. He got the best technology he could from the UK, from the US, from Germany. A difficult business environment for Indians, but benefits too in taking the best from the then global opportunities available. Move on quite a way, the license permit Raj. It made it the kind of protectionism that perhaps some people would say helps you build up companies, domestic companies, the nation building perhaps of its day. I mean, the founders thought that's what they were doing, nation building. That's what motivated them. The license permit Raj, yes, helpful, but also created big problems for those like the Tatas who wanted to work straight and competitively. So into the liberalisation age, a two-edged sword perhaps. I mean, it makes you work harder, liberalisation, competition. Overall, absolutely positive for the Indian economy, I think, but also the spur to activity overseas. So some of this is just about the domestic history. What a company, an organism starts somewhere, circumstances change, it has to adapt. Good ones, capable ones, adapt. Well, what did we do? We started acquiring some companies. There's a logic to all of them, of course. Tata Tea and Tetley Tea, Global Beverages as it now is. Steel and steel, automotive and automotive. What makes it work? It helps to have some money. A long-term...
Can we get back to what makes it work? Just have a...
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So, he talked about liberalization and, 1991, right? This reform. So, at that point in time, many of us felt that liberalization would open up the Indian domestic market and that there would be a focus of Indian companies, Indian business groups would be on the domestic market rather than going back. 20 years later, we find that it's a little more different than that. There's been a whole amount, as you pointed out, not just the Tata Group, but several groups have gone broad, undertaken mergers, acquisitions, set up greenfield operations. How did that come about? What precipitated the going out of Indian companies?
I'll just go back to the history on the liberalization and pre-liberalization part of it. When India became independent in 1947, we had been ruled by Britishers for almost 200-300 years. And when we became independent, the first reaction was that we should not trade. Because those guys came to trade, they subjugated us, and so we should try to produce everything what we need, and we should consume what we need. We should not consume anything which we don't produce. And so it became like a closed economy. We wanted to only look within. We had no connect outside. In fact, I remember there was a movie called Around the World in $8. It's a Hindi movie, but it said that a person would get $8 a day when he goes abroad, and that also if he's lucky. And so from those days to 91, in some sense, the early days, we were not exposed. Almost from 1947 to 1991, 44 years, 3 generations almost, did not have any exposure to the rest of the world. And that created a huge gap in terms of trading with outside world. People came from outside, they had JV, some of them had also their own companies. In fact, some of the companies were multinationals already existing in India, like Unilever or ABB or Siemens, Cadbury's, and so on and so forth. Many of them were actually existing in India for practically hundreds of years or since they have been existing, and they were in India since independence, and they were kind of doing well. But 1991 onwards, slowly people started getting exposure to the rest of the world. They started figuring out that the outsiders are not so brilliant. We can do better than them. And so when I used to go to US in 1993, 94, first time started going to US, most of the stories about Indians, in fact here also, was about snake charmers and the cows running on the roads. They still run on the roads. I'm not saying they don't. Right? But now when I come here or go to US, everyone thinks that Indians are either doctors or engineers. And they do IT work. So somewhere 20 years and things have changed. And those guys who went out, either from IIT studying there, and that's why for me, when you say Indian multinationals, I have 3-4 different ways of kind of defining them. Is it that a company originated in India and has still got Indian owners? Or is it a person whose forefathers had left India and is now still called Indian, like people in Africa? In fact, last week there was an article in Wall Street Journal that China is doing it on state basis into Ghana and so on and so forth. But Indians are not far behind. It's just that Mahatma Gandhi got his first job in South Africa in 1911 or something. So Indians have been there in South Africa. I think Hindujas are some of the early examples of moving out of India early on. And then later on, 1991 onwards, many more companies have gone in. But the recent guy who became a billionaire was actually an investor in Twitter. So for me, what is an Indian multinational, I don't know. Whether it is because a company originated in India, or a company has Indian origin owners, or a company which kind of is still calling itself headquarters in India, where the consolidation happens. We have many more companies, like we had talked about Tatas, but there is one large group called Birlas. They are pretty much similar size. And they recently acquired a company in Canada around 3-4 years back in aluminium called Novelis. Ambani's, which are again similar size, two groups are there. You never know which one you are talking about. I used to work for them. And they have acquired many companies across the world. And so you have several people. In fact, there are Videocon guys who are basically into consumer electronics in India, but they are heavily into oil and gas exploration outside. Recently, one of their exploration areas found some huge amount of oil in Brazil. And so, of course, the public sector units also have gone out, government-owned companies, ONGC, MMTC, and so on and so forth. In fact, Ambani's also have acquired companies in life sciences recently. Right. So, Piramals and, of course, for me, Vinod Khosla is one more Indian multinational. I don't know if you have heard of Vinod Khosla. He's an interesting guy. He has been part of setting up a Sun, that is the Sun Microsystems, if you know Unix operating systems and so on and so forth. They were competing with Microsoft those days. And he has been part of almost all legendary sort of new from Google, all the startups which have become big. He has been somehow behind that. So for me, Indian multinational means many things to many people.
Excellent.